Right now, you're sitting somewhere warm. Maybe you've got a heater running. Maybe you're under blankets. Maybe you're in a climate-controlled room where the temperature never drops below comfortable. And if you want fire, it's easy. Flick a lighter, turn on a stove, strike a match. We take it for granted. Fire is something humans just have, something we've always controlled, right? Wrong. If you rewind 400,000 years, you'll find a group of humans, our evolutionary cousins, surviving through some of the most brutal ice ages this planet has ever seen. We're talking about temperatures that regularly drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius, glaciers covering half of Europe, frozen tundra stretching for thousands of miles, winters that lasted 8, 9, sometimes 10 months of the year. And here's the thing that keeps archaeologists awake at night. These people, the Neanderthals, survived all of it with almost no reliable fire. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and definitely tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love checking comments and seeing someone in Melbourne at morning coffee, someone in Chicago at midnight, someone in Dubai during a lunch break. All of us scattered across the planet, connected by curiosity about the people who came before us. Now, when I say Neanderthals survived without reliable fire, I don't mean they never used it. The archaeological record shows they definitely encountered fire, used it sometimes, maybe even maintained it when they found it. But here's what's missing: the evidence that they could make it consistently whenever they needed it. Modern humans from the same time period. Their archaeological sites are packed with hearths, carefully constructed fire pits, evidence of repeated controlled burning. Tools specifically designed for making fire. Clear patterns of fire used at almost every major site. Neanderthal sites, surprisingly empty. A hearth here, some burned bones there. Long stretches with nothing at all. Some sites that were clearly occupied for years, maybe decades, with zero evidence of fire whatsoever. And we're not talking about a few sites. We're talking about hundreds of locations across Europe and Asia, spanning 400,000 years of Neanderthal existence. The paradox is staggering. You can't survive a European Ice Age winter without heat. It's not difficult. It's impossible. The human body, even the robust Neanderthal body, cannot maintain core temperature in sub-zero conditions for months without some external heat source. You'd die of hypothermia within days, maybe hours depending on the conditions, and yet they didn't die. They survived, thrived even, for nearly 500,000 years, through at least 4 major glacial periods, through climate conditions that would kill an unprepared modern human in a weekend camping trip. So how? That's the question that's been haunting anthropologists since we first started finding Neanderthal remains in the 1800s. For a long time, the assumption was simple. We just haven't found the evidence yet. Keep digging, and we'll find the hearths, the fire-making tools, the proof that Neanderthals had fire technology just like we did. But we've been digging for over 150 years now. We've excavated hundreds of Neanderthal sites. We've used ground-penetrating radar, chemical analysis, microscopic examination of soil layers. We've employed every tool modern archaeology has to offer, and the evidence still isn't there. Oh, there's some fire use. Absolutely. But nothing like what you'd expect from a population that supposedly depended on it for survival. Nothing like what we see with anatomically modern humans who lived in the same regions during the same time periods. It's like finding a civilization that survived in the Arctic without winter clothing. Technically, you found a coat here and there, but nowhere near enough to explain how they didn't freeze to death. This is where the story gets really interesting, because if Neanderthals weren't relying on fire the way we thought they were, then how are they surviving? What other strategies, what biological adaptations, what behavioral innovations did they develop that we've completely overlooked? See, for the past century, we've been studying Neanderthals through the lens of what modern humans would need to survive in Ice Age Europe. We assume they needed fire because we would need fire. We assume they needed complex shelters because we would need complex shelters. We assume they needed sophisticated clothing because we would need sophisticated clothing. But what if we've had it backward this whole time? What if Neanderthals weren't just primitive versions of us, struggling to survive with inadequate technology? What if they were fundamentally different survivors, adapted in ways we've barely begun to understand? Ways that didn't require constant fire, that didn't depend on the technologies we consider essential. The evidence has been there all along, hiding in plain sight. In their bones, in their body proportions, in the locations they chose to live, in what they ate, in how they organised their social groups. We just weren't asking the right questions. Tonight we're going to explore those questions. We're going to dig into the archaeological evidence, examine what those Neanderthal bones can tell us about cold adaptation, look at shelter strategies that don't require fire, investigate dietary approaches that modern nutritionists are only now beginning to understand, and piece together a picture of survival that challenges everything we thought we knew about human evolution. Because understanding how Neanderthals survived 400,000 winters without reliable fire isn't just about them. It's about the remarkable flexibility of human adaptation. It's about the many different ways a human body and a human mind can solve the problem of staying alive in a hostile world. So get comfortable. Let's go back. Way back. Let's talk about fire. Because if you're going to survive 400,000 winters without dying of hypothermia, fire seems like the obvious answer, right? Just huddle around the flames, cook your food, keep the predators away, and wait for spring. Problem solved. Except here's the thing. The archaeological evidence suggests Neanderthals didn't have reliable fire for most of their existence. And when I say didn't have reliable fire, I don't mean they were rubbing sticks together with only moderate success. I mean vast stretches of their timeline show little to no evidence of systematic fire use at all. This is the fire problem, and it's one of the most confusing mysteries in human evolution. Let's start with what we actually know. Archaeologists have excavated hundreds of Neanderthal sites across Europe and Asia, sites spanning the entire 400,000-year timeline of their species. And when you look at these sites systematically, what you find is sporadic fire use. Not consistent, not reliable, sporadic. Some sites show clear evidence of hearths, controlled fires that were maintained in specific locations, sometimes for extended periods. Ash deposits, burned bone, heat-altered stone, all the signatures of intentional fire management. But these sites are the exception, not the rule. The majority of Neanderthal sites, especially earlier ones, show either no fire evidence at all, or such minimal traces that archaeologists can't determine if the fire was even human-controlled. Take Kibara Cave in Israel. This is one of the most extensively studied Neanderthal sites in the world, occupied repeatedly over tens of thousands of years, and yes, there's fire evidence, but not continuous fire evidence. The hearths appear in some layers and are completely absent from others. Same cave, same people, sometimes fire, sometimes not. Or look at Abric Romani in Spain, another major Neanderthal site with excellent preservation. The archaeological layers show intermittent fire use spanning thousands of years. Some occupation levels have clear hearths, others nothing. The Neanderthals were there. They were making tools, they were processing food, but they weren't consistently using fire. Now compare this to Homo sapiens sites from the same time periods. Modern human sites show ubiquitous fire use. Every site, every layer, hearths are everywhere. Fire isn't optional for modern humans, it's fundamental to their survival strategy. The difference is stark enough that some archaeologists have proposed using fire frequency as a diagnostic tool to distinguish between Neanderthal and modern human occupations. So what's going on? If fire is so important for survival in Ice Age Europe, and Neanderthals clearly knew about fire and used it sometimes, why didn't they use it all the time? The leading hypothesis is that Neanderthals could maintain fire but struggled to create it on demand. This might sound like a trivial distinction, but it's actually huge. Maintaining fire is relatively easy. You keep feeding it fuel, you protect it from wind and rain. You can transport it as embers wrapped in bark or moss. You can keep a fire going for weeks, months, maybe even years if you're careful. But creating fire from scratch? That's incredibly difficult without modern tools. Try making fire with primitive technology sometime. Not with a lighter or matches, with sticks or stones. It's brutally hard. You need exactly the right materials. You need specific techniques. You need practice and skill. And you need the knowledge to be transmitted reliably across generations. Modern humans developed systematic fire-making technologies. Bow drills, hand drills, striker-like techniques using pyrite and flint. These methods could create fire on demand with reasonable reliability. Evidence suggests these technologies emerged among modern human populations in Africa and spread as part of their cultural toolkit. Neanderthals might never have developed these techniques, or they might have developed them in some populations, but failed to transmit the knowledge reliably. Without systematic fire-making ability, they would have depended on natural fire sources, lightning strikes, volcanic activity, spontaneous combustion of organic materials. These fires could be captured and maintained, but once they went out, there might not be another opportunity for weeks or months. This explains the sporadic pattern we see in the archaeological record. Some Neanderthal groups in some places at some times had access to fire and used it extensively. Others didn't. The technology wasn't universal, it wasn't reliable, and crucially it wasn't essential to their survival strategy, because they survived anyway. That's the really wild part. For 400,000 years, across dozens of glacial cycles, Neanderthals expanded into and maintained populations in some of the coldest environments on Earth, often without consistent fire use. Let's put this in climate context. The Neanderthal timeline spans multiple major glaciations. The Riss glaciation, from about 300,000 to 130,000 years ago, was one of the most severe ice ages in the last million years. Ice sheets, kilometres thick, covered northern Europe. Temperatures in unglaciated regions were 10 to 15 degrees Celsius colder than today. Winter temperatures in Central Europe could drop to -30 or -40 Celsius. Then came a brief interglacial period, the Eemian, when temperatures actually warmed above present levels for a few thousand years. Neanderthals didn't just survive this, they thrived, expanding their range and increasing their population. Then the Würm glaciation began around 110,000 years ago. This was the last great ice age, and it was brutal. Not as severe as the Riss overall, but with extreme temperature fluctuations. The climate would shift dramatically over periods of just a few decades. Mild periods followed by sudden returns to full, glacial conditions. Neanderthals lived through all of it, and through much of this time, fire evidence in their sites remained sporadic at best. Let's look at some specific examples. Linford Quarry in England, a Neanderthal site dating to about 60,000 years ago, right in the middle of the Würm glaciation. The site shows extensive evidence of mammoth hunting. Neanderthals were systematically butchering these massive animals, processing tons of meat and bone. But fire evidence? Minimal. Some scholars argue there's no convincing fire evidence at all. Or consider the sites in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. Denisova Cave and nearby locations show Neanderthal occupation in some of the coldest environments they ever inhabited. Winter temperatures that would have regularly dropped below -40 Celsius. And while there's some fire evidence in these caves, it's nowhere near as extensive as you'd expect if fire were essential for survival. The sites in Germany tell a similar story. Taubach, Weimar, Bilzingsleben. These are open-air sites from glacial periods. Neanderthals were living there, making tools, hunting, processing food. Fire evidence is either absent or ambiguous. Some archaeologists argue the burned materials at these sites might be from natural fires, not human-controlled ones. Now, there are absolutely Neanderthal sites with extensive fire evidence. La Côte de Saint-Brelade in Jersey shows clear hearths. Shanidar Cave in Iraq has multiple fire layers. Pêche de Lazé in France shows sophisticated fire management. But these sites are notable precisely because they're exceptions. They prove Neanderthals could use fire effectively when they had it. But they also highlight how unusual consistent fire use was in the broader archaeological record. This pattern has created fierce debate among archaeologists. Some argue the absence of fire evidence is just a preservation issue. Fire traces can be destroyed by geological processes. Ash can be blown away. Burned material can decompose. Maybe Neanderthals used fire extensively, but we just can't detect it in the archaeological record. Others point out that we can detect modern human fire use just fine in similar conditions. If preservation was the issue, we'd see the same pattern in Homo sapiens sites from the same regions and time periods. But we don't. Modern humans show ubiquitous fire evidence. Neanderthals don't. Some researchers have suggested the sporadic fire use reflects cognitive limitations. Maybe Neanderthals couldn't plan ahead well enough to maintain fire reliably. Maybe they lacked the social organization to assign individuals to fire-tending duties. Maybe they couldn't transmit fire-making knowledge effectively across generations. This interpretation is controversial because it implies Neanderthals were cognitively inferior to modern humans, a claim that makes many anthropologists uncomfortable given Neanderthals' other achievements. But there's another interpretation, one that's less about cognitive capacity and more about adaptive strategy. Maybe Neanderthals didn't rely heavily on fire because they didn't need to. Maybe they had evolved biological and behavioral adaptations that allowed them to survive cold conditions without constant fire use, not because they were too dumb to use fire, but because they were so well adapted to the cold that fire was optional rather than essential. Think about it this way. Fire is incredibly demanding. You need constant fuel. You need to tend it continuously. You need to protect it from weather. You need to transport it when you move camps. And most crucially, you're tied to it. You can't range far from your fire without risking death from exposure. Fire creates a radius of survival, but it also creates a tether. What if Neanderthals evolved a different strategy? What if their bodies and behaviors were so well adapted to cold that they could move freely through winter landscapes without depending on fire for survival? They could still use fire opportunistically when it was available. It would make life more comfortable. It would help with food processing, but it wouldn't be essential. They could survive weeks or months without it if necessary. This would explain the archaeological pattern perfectly. Fire when available, but not required. Use when convenient, but not dependent. Optional rather than obligatory. It would also explain something else that's puzzled researchers for decades: how Neanderthals expanded their range so far north without reliable fire technology. There are Neanderthal sites above the Arctic Circle, sites where winter daylight lasts only a few hours and temperatures drop to extremes that would kill modern humans in minutes without protection. If these Neanderthals depended on fire for survival, they would have needed to maintain it continuously for 8 months of the year. They would have needed vast fuel supplies and constant tending. There's no evidence they were doing this. The alternative is that they were biologically capable of withstanding cold exposure that would be lethal to us. That their bodies were so efficient at generating and conserving heat that they could survive winter conditions without fire, or with only minimal intermittent fire use. This isn't as crazy as it sounds. Other mammals manage similar feats. Arctic foxes survive winters at -50 Celsius without any behavioral thermoregulation beyond finding shelter. Musk oxen endure months of extreme cold with just their wool coats. Seals and walruses thrive in Arctic waters. Mammals can evolve remarkable cold adaptations when selection pressure is strong enough. And Neanderthals had 400,000 years of intense selection for cold tolerance. That's enough time for substantial biological adaptation. Enough time for their bodies to develop strategies we can barely imagine, because we've never needed them. So here's the hypothesis we're exploring. Neanderthals survived those 400,000 winters not by mastering fire, but by becoming biological furnaces themselves. By evolving bodies and behaviours so efficient at generating and conserving heat that they could function in conditions that would kill modern humans. By developing survival strategies that didn't depend on the unreliable technology of fire-making, but instead relied on the reliable technology of their own metabolism. The evidence for this is written in their bones, their sights, and their incredible persistence in environments where fire alone wouldn't have been enough to keep them alive. Let's look at how they actually did it. Let's talk about the Neanderthal body, because this is where things get really interesting. When you look at a Neanderthal skeleton next to a modern human skeleton, you're not just seeing two slightly different versions of the same thing. You're seeing 400,000 years of evolutionary engineering specifically designed to solve one problem. How do you keep a human body alive in an Ice Age winter without reliable fire? The answer is written in every bone, every joint, every proportion of the Neanderthal frame. Start with the overall build. Neanderthals were short. Males averaged around 5'5", females closer to 5'1". But here's the thing, they weren't just short. They were built like fire hydrants. Barrel-chested, incredibly broad-shouldered, with limbs that were noticeably shorter relative to their torsos than modern humans. This wasn't random, this was physics. There's a principle in biology called Bergmann's rule. It states that within a species, populations living in colder climates tend to be larger and more compact than those in warmer regions. And within those compact bodies, there's an even more specific pattern called Allen's rule, which says that cold-adapted animals have shorter appendages, shorter limbs, smaller ears, anything that sticks out and loses heat. Look at polar bears compared to their brown bear cousins in warmer climates. Look at Arctic foxes versus desert foxes. Look at Inuit populations compared to equatorial African populations. The same patterns appear over and over because they're solving the same thermodynamic problem. Heat loss is proportional to surface area. Heat production is proportional to volume. A compact, stocky body has less surface area relative to its volume. Less surface area means less heat escaping into the environment. More volume relative to surface means more metabolically active tissue generating warmth from the inside out. Neanderthals took this principle and ran with it. Their body proportions gave them roughly 10% less surface area per unit of body mass compared to modern humans of the same weight. 10% might not sound like much, but when you're trying to survive a winter that lasts 8 months with temperatures regularly dropping below freezing, that 10% difference in heat retention could mean the difference between waking up in the morning and dying of hypothermia in your sleep. But the engineering went way deeper than just being short and stocky. Look at the Neanderthal chest cavity. It's not just broad, it's absolutely massive with ribs that flare out to create this barrel-shaped thorax. This created space for larger lungs, which Neanderthals definitely needed. But it also created something else: insulation. That thick ribcage surrounded by layers of muscle and fat created a protective shell around the body's core organs. Heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, the critical systems that absolutely must stay warm or you die. The Neanderthal build essentially created a biological fortress around these vital organs. Then there's the nasal cavity, and this is where you can really see evolution getting creative. If you look at a Neanderthal skull, one of the first things you notice is the enormous nose. massive nasal openings projecting forward from the face, with internal nasal passages that were substantially larger and more complex than those of modern humans. This wasn't about having a better sense of smell. This was climate control technology built into the skull itself. When you breathe cold air, several bad things happen to your body. First, that frigid air hits your lungs and causes immediate vasoconstriction. Your blood vessels tighten up, which can lead to respiratory problems. Second, cold air is usually very dry, and dry air damages the delicate tissues in your respiratory system. Third, breathing cold air forces your body to expend precious calories, warming and humidifying every breath before it reaches your lungs. The Neanderthal nasal cavity solved all three problems simultaneously. Those enormous nasal passages created a long, winding path that cold air had to travel before reaching the lungs. As air moved through this maze, it was warmed by the heat radiating from blood vessels in the nasal tissues. The moisture in those tissues humidified the dry air. By the time air reached the lungs, it was already close to body temperature and properly humidified. Modern studies using CT scans and airflow modelling have shown that Neanderthal nasal passages were incredibly efficient at this process. More efficient than modern human noses, more efficient even than the nasal structures of modern cold-adapted populations like the Inuit. This was an adaptation refined over hundreds of thousands of years of Ice Age winters. But all of this, the compact build, the barrel chest, the enormous nose, it came with a cost, a serious cost that shaped everything about how Neanderthals lived. Thermodynamics cuts both ways. Yes, a compact body loses less heat. But a compact, heavily muscled body also needs more fuel to keep running. Way more fuel. Modern studies using metabolic modelling based on Neanderthal skeletal proportions suggest they needed somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 calories per day just to maintain basic body functions. That's nearly double what an average modern human needs. Think about what this means. A Neanderthal couldn't afford to skip meals, couldn't afford to go more than a day or two without substantial food intake. Their entire existence was governed by this relentless caloric demand. They were biological furnaces that needed constant stoking or they'd burn out. This is why Neanderthals were obligate carnivores, heavily dependent on large game. You can't get 5,000 calories a day from gathering plants in Ice Age Europe. There weren't enough edible plants, and the ones that existed were seasonal and unreliable. You needed meat, lots of it, preferably fatty meat from large animals, mammoth, woolly rhino, reindeer, bison, animals that could provide thousands of calories in a single kill. And here's where it gets even more interesting. That high metabolic rate wasn't just a cost, it was also a heating system. All that metabolic activity generated heat, constant internal heat production, that helped maintain core body temperature even in extreme cold. Neanderthals were basically running their metabolism in overdrive all the time, burning calories at a tremendous rate, but staying warm in the process. The bone structure tells the same story. Neanderthal skeletons show bone density that's substantially higher than modern humans. Their long bones, femurs, humeri, tibias are thicker and more robust, with attachment points for muscles that would make modern bodybuilders weep with envy. This wasn't just about being strong, though they were definitely incredibly strong. This was about insulation and heat generation. Dense bone contains more metabolically active tissue. More tissue means more heat production. And all that muscle attached to those bones, that was a furnace all by itself. Muscle tissue generates heat continuously through normal metabolic processes. When you're cold, your muscles shiver to generate additional heat. But even without shivering, muscle mass produces background warmth just by existing. A heavily muscled, thick-boned Neanderthal body was essentially a biological heating system. Every movement, every activity generated heat. Hunting, processing carcasses, moving through the landscape, all of it contributed to maintaining body temperature. And when they were at rest, that muscle mass continued producing background warmth. But there might have been another adaptation at work, something we can't see in the fossil record but can infer from genetics and comparative biology: brown adipose tissue or brown fat. Most people think of fat as just stored energy, white fat that sits there waiting to be burned for calories. But there's another type of fat tissue that does something different. Brown fat contains an enormous number of mitochondria, the cellular power plants, and these mitochondria can produce heat directly without shivering. This process is called non-shivering thermogenesis. Human infants have substantial amounts of brown fat. It's how babies keep warm before they develop the ability to shiver effectively. Most adults lose most of their brown fat, but cold-adapted mammals, seals, bears, Arctic ground squirrels maintain significant brown fat deposits throughout their lives. It's one of the key adaptations for surviving extreme cold. Did Neanderthals have more brown fat than modern humans? We can't know for certain. Brown fat doesn't fossilize. But genetic analysis of Neanderthal DNA recovered from ancient bones has revealed something tantalizing. Several genetic variants related to metabolism and fat tissue differentiation show patterns consistent with enhanced brown fat development and maintenance. These aren't proof. You can't reconstruct soft tissue biology from DNA alone, but they're suggestive. They hint that Neanderthals might have retained more active brown fat into adulthood, providing another layer of cold protection that modern humans largely lack. The genetics reveal other cold climate adaptations too. Analysis of Neanderthal genomes shows variants in genes related to skin and hair development, variants that in modern cold-adapted populations are associated with thicker skin and denser body hair. We'll never know exactly what Neanderthal skin looked like, whether they had substantial body hair or relied more on behavioral adaptations like clothing, but their genes suggest they were equipped for direct exposure to cold in ways modern humans aren't. There's also evidence of variants in genes controlling circadian rhythms and seasonal metabolism. These genes help organisms adjust their metabolic rate and activity patterns to match seasonal changes. In modern animals adapted to extreme seasonal environments, similar genetic variants allow them to increase fat storage before winter, reduce activity during the coldest months, and maintain metabolic efficiency during periods of food scarcity. Neanderthals appear to have had enhanced versions of these seasonal adaptation genes, suggesting their bodies could automatically adjust metabolic processes to match the dramatic seasonal variations of Ice Age Europe. In summer, when food was more abundant, they could have ramped up activity and built fat reserves. In winter, their metabolism might have shifted into a more efficient mode that conserved calories while maintaining core temperature. This kind of seasonal metabolic flexibility is common in animals that face extreme seasonal variation, but it's largely absent in modern humans who evolved in more stable equatorial environments. Neanderthals, shaped by 400,000 years of Ice Age winters, had apparently evolved biological mechanisms for handling seasonal extremes that we simply don't possess. Now, if all of this sounds familiar, it should. Neanderthals weren't the only Ice Age species that evolved these adaptations. They were part of a whole ecosystem of cold-adapted megafauna, all solving similar problems in similar ways. Woolly mammoths had compact bodies with short tails and small ears. Cave bears were stockier than their modern descendants. Woolly rhinos had shortened limbs relative to their body size. Even the plants were adapted, with Ice Age flora showing patterns of compact growth and enhanced cold tolerance. Neanderthals were essentially the human version of these Ice Age specialists. They had become, through hundreds of thousands of years of natural selection, as perfectly adapted to glacial climates as woolly mammoths were. In some ways, even better adapted, because they had behavioral flexibility that mammoths lacked. They could make tools, build shelters, work cooperatively in ways that multiplied the effectiveness of their biological adaptations. But here's the thing about being perfectly adapted to a specific environment. It locks you in. Those adaptations that made Neanderthals so successful in Ice Age Europe became liabilities when conditions changed, or when they encountered competition from a more flexible species. That 5,000 calorie per day metabolism that kept them warm in glacial winters meant they could never afford to go hungry. They were always just days away from starvation, always dependent on successful hunts. When climate fluctuations disrupted game migrations, or when competition from modern humans made hunting less reliable, Neanderthals had no metabolic safety margin. Their compact builds that conserved heat so efficiently also meant they couldn't cover distances as efficiently as the longer-legged modern humans. In a landscape where mobility meant access to resources, this was a significant disadvantage. Their massive nasal passages that warmed frigid air so effectively required large, robust facial structures. This meant their skulls were heavier, their bite force was greater, but it also meant they had less room for certain types of vocal apparatus. Some researchers think this might have limited their speech capabilities compared to modern humans, though this is still hotly debated. Evolution had made Neanderthals into supremely effective Ice Age survivors, but it had also made them specialists. And when the modern humans arrived, behaviourally flexible, technologically innovative, capable of adapting quickly to changing circumstances, the Neanderthals' specialised adaptations couldn't save them. Their biology had been shaped by 400,000 winters. It had been tested and refined by natural selection acting over thousands of generations. It was, in its own way, perfect, but perfect for a specific set of circumstances. And when those circumstances changed, when the competition shifted, when new challenges emerged, biological perfection wasn't enough. The Neanderthal body tells us something profound about adaptation and survival. Sometimes the traits that make you supremely successful in one context become the very things that limit you when the world changes. Sometimes being too perfectly adapted is its own kind of vulnerability. But for 400,000 years, it worked. Those barrel chests and enormous noses, that dense bone and massive musculature, those genetic variants, for brown fat and seasonal metabolism, all of it combined to create a human species that could survive Ice Age winters without huddling around fires every night. They were built for the cold, and for hundreds of thousands of years, that was enough. So the Neanderthals had bodies designed for the cold. They could generate heat more efficiently, conserve it better, and withstand temperatures that would kill us. But here's the thing about winter in Ice Age Europe. It doesn't matter how well adapted you are. Eventually the cold gets through. A human body, even a Neanderthal body, loses heat constantly. You can slow the loss, but you can't stop it. And when outside temperatures drop to -20, -30 degrees Celsius, which was routine during glacial maximums, no amount of biological adaptation keeps you alive without shelter. The Neanderthals knew this. The archaeological evidence makes it absolutely clear. They weren't just randomly camping wherever they happened to be when the sun went down. They were choosing shelter sites with the kind of precision that suggests deep understanding of thermal physics. Not the equations, obviously, but the practical, observable principles. They knew where warmth could be found, where it could be preserved, and how to position themselves to take maximum advantage of natural architecture. Let's start with the obvious choice: caves. When archaeologists first started studying Neanderthals, they called them cavemen, and while that term has become problematic, carrying implications of primitiveness that aren't justified, the basic observation was correct. Neanderthals used caves extensively, not because they were stupid or lazy, but because caves are thermodynamically brilliant shelters. Here's why. Rock has something called thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. A massive limestone cliff, the kind that forms deep cave systems across Europe, acts like a gigantic thermal battery. During summer, the rock absorbs heat from the sun. During winter, it releases that stored heat gradually, maintaining relatively stable temperatures deep inside the cave system. Archaeological surveys of known Neanderthal cave sites show interior temperatures that remain between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius year-round, even when outside temperatures swing from -30 in winter to +30 in summer. That might not sound warm. 10 degrees is still pretty cold, but it's survivable. More importantly, it's predictable. You can plan around it. You know that if you retreat deep enough into the cave system, you'll find temperatures that won't kill you, that won't cause hypothermia if you're healthy and well fed. This is the difference between desperate survival and strategic adaptation. But the Neanderthals weren't just crawling into any random cave and hoping for the best. The site selection patterns are remarkably consistent across Europe. They preferred deep limestone caves with specific characteristics, multiple chambers so different areas could be used for different purposes, south-facing entrances in northern latitudes to maximize sun exposure during the brief winter days, narrow openings that could be blocked to prevent cold air infiltration, while maintaining enough ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning or oxygen depletion. Look at La Ferracie in southwestern France. This site was occupied by Neanderthals on and off for over 25,000 years. It's not a huge cave system, but it has everything they needed. A south-facing entrance that catches the low winter sun, a main chamber deep enough to maintain stable temperatures, side chambers that could be used for specific activities. And this is the detail that really shows their sophistication. The Neanderthals who used La Ferracie didn't just occupy the space randomly, they organized it. Archaeological excavations show clear spatial patterning. Specific areas were used for butchering animals, others for tool-making. Still others, deeper in the cave where temperatures were most stable, appear to have been designated sleeping areas. They were creating structured living spaces within natural architecture. This isn't primitive. This is urban planning on a small scale, the recognition that different activities have different spatial requirements, and the organizational capacity to implement that recognition consistently over generations. The evidence from Moldova in Ukraine shows they were doing the same thing in open-air sites. No caves here. The landscape is too flat, the geology too young for extensive cave systems. But Neanderthals occupied this region during some of the coldest periods of the Ice Age. How? They built structures, not permanent buildings in the modern sense, but sophisticated temporary shelters designed to maximize heat retention. The Moldova site shows a circular structure about 26 feet in diameter, made from mammoth bones, skulls, long bones, ribs, arranged in a pattern that clearly shows intentional construction. These bones would have formed the framework, probably covered with animal hides and potentially insulated with grass, moss, or even snow. Inside the structure, archaeologists found evidence of hearths, though whether these were used continuously or only occasionally remains debated. But here's what's not debatable. This structure was positioned in a depression in the landscape, protected from wind. The entrance faced south, away from prevailing winter winds, and the whole thing was designed to create the smallest possible enclosed space that could still shelter a group of humans. This is critical. The Neanderthals understood something fundamental about thermodynamics. Small spaces warm faster and lose heat slower than large ones. A group of 20 Neanderthals, each generating heat, packed into a 26-foot diameter shelter, would significantly raise the interior temperature just through body heat. Not to comfortable levels, but maybe from -20 outside to 0 inside. That's the difference between sleeping and freezing to death. The strategic importance of group size becomes obvious when you think about the thermal dynamics. Too few people, and you don't generate enough collective body heat to warm the space. Too many, and you can't find enough food to feed everyone. The archaeological evidence suggests Neanderthal groups averaged 20 to 30 individuals. That's not random, that's optimization. Enough people to defend territory, hunt large game, and provide collective warmth. Few enough to be mobile, to find adequate resources, to fit into the kinds of shelters that could actually retain heat. But they weren't just staying in one place all winter. The site distribution patterns across Europe show something more complex. Seasonal migration. Not random wandering, but systematic movement following predictable patterns. This makes perfect sense from a survival perspective. Game animals migrated seasonally, following vegetation and seeking better conditions. Staying in one location year-round meant either travelling farther and farther for food, or depleting local resources to the point where the group couldn't survive. So Neanderthals moved, but they moved strategically, following routes that connected high-quality shelter sites. We can trace these patterns in the archaeological record. Winter sites tend to be deep caves or well-protected valleys. Summer sites are often more open, positioned to take advantage of good hunting near migration routes. Spring and fall sites are transitional, places that offered acceptable shelter and access to seasonal resources. Some sites show evidence of repeated occupation over thousands of years. Not continuous habitation, but regular returns. The Neanderthals knew the landscape intimately. They knew which caves stayed warm in winter, which valleys provided the best hunting in spring, which rock shelters offered protection during autumn storms. This knowledge was cumulative, passed from generation to generation. Your parents showed you the routes, you showed your children. Over time, this created cultural knowledge networks that were themselves adaptive strategies. In some regions, Neanderthals appear to have preferentially selected sites near geothermal features, places where underground volcanic activity warmed springs or created areas of anomalously warm ground. This is sophisticated environmental exploitation. Geothermal sites aren't obvious. You have to know what to look for. Warm water springs that don't freeze even in the depths of winter. Areas where snow melts faster than surrounding regions. Caves that feel noticeably warmer than similar caves nearby. Several Neanderthal sites in Italy and southern France are positioned near documented geothermal activity. This might not be coincidence. In a world where every degree of temperature matters for survival, a shelter site that's naturally 5 degrees warmer than alternatives would be precious. Groups that controlled such sites would have significant survival advantages. You can imagine conflicts over these locations, territorial defense becoming more intense in regions where thermal advantages were substantial. South-facing cliff shelters show another aspect of this strategic thinking. In northern latitudes, the low winter sun comes from the south. A rock overhang facing south catches maximum sunlight during the day. The rock absorbs this heat and radiates it back during the night. It's not much, but it's something. The difference between a south-facing shelter and a north-facing one might be only a few degrees, but over the course of a months-long winter, that difference compounds. Slightly warmer means slightly less energy expenditure. Slightly less energy expenditure means slightly better survival odds, and in evolutionary terms, slight advantages sustained over thousands of generations become overwhelming. The archaeological evidence from Gibraltar shows Neanderthals using coastal caves that were positioned to avoid the worst winter storms while still allowing access to marine resources. These weren't the deepest caves or the most protected. They were positioned at a sweet spot, sheltered enough to be habitable, but open enough to provide views of the coast and quick access to shellfish beds and seal colonies that represented critical winter food sources. This is risk management. The Neanderthals were balancing multiple factors: thermal protection, access to food, defensibility, availability of fresh water, distance from competing groups. They were making complex decisions based on accumulated knowledge and real-time assessment of conditions. This is cognitive sophistication that matches anything modern hunter-gatherers do, and they were adapting these strategies to local conditions. Neanderthals in Spain used different shelter patterns than those in Germany. Those in coastal regions had different priorities than those in continental interiors. This isn't evidence of different species or subspecies, it's evidence of behavioral flexibility, the ability to take general principles and apply them to specific circumstances. Some sites show evidence of windbreaks constructed within caves, piles of stones arranged to block drafts, collections of wooden poles that might have supported hide barriers dividing cave spaces into smaller sections. We can't be certain of the details because organic materials rarely survive, but the stone arrangements are telling. They show intentional modification of natural spaces to improve their thermal properties. At several sites, archaeologists have found what appear to be insulated sleeping areas, depressions in cave floors lined with layers of grass or other plant materials. These would have provided insulation from the cold ground, reducing heat loss through conduction. It's a simple technology, but it's effective. Modern survival experts use the same technique. The Neanderthals were also using fire when they had it. But here's what's interesting about the hearth patterns. Fires weren't positioned randomly. They were placed strategically to maximize heat distribution, while minimizing smoke accumulation, often near cave entrances where smoke could escape, but heat could radiate into deeper chambers, or in depressions where heated stones could be left to radiate warmth after the fire went out. This suggests they understood thermal dynamics well enough to engineer their living spaces, not through calculation, but through observation, experimentation, and cultural transmission of successful techniques. Your group discovers that fires placed in depressions stay hot longer. This knowledge gets passed down. Other groups observe and adopt the technique. Over generations, it becomes standard practice. The small group sizes that were necessary for thermal efficiency also had social implications. 20 to 30 people in a confined space for months at a time requires social organization. You need ways to manage conflict, distribute resources fairly, coordinate activities. The evidence of spatial organization within shelter sites suggests they had these systems, leaders or decision-making councils, social hierarchies that were respected, behavioral norms that prevented destructive conflict in situations where group cohesion was literally a matter of survival. Because that's the final piece of the shelter strategy. The recognition that the shelter isn't just the physical structure, it's the social structure within it. A perfectly positioned cave with ideal thermal properties is worthless if the group inside it tears itself apart. The Neanderthals who survived weren't just the ones who found the best caves. They were the ones who could maintain group cohesion in close quarters under stressful conditions for extended periods. This is why we find evidence of care for the disabled at Neanderthal sites. Individuals with injuries that would have made them unable to contribute to hunting or gathering, but who survived for years afterward. Someone was feeding them, protecting them, keeping them warm. This is only possible in groups with strong social bonds and the organizational capacity to support non-productive members. The shelter strategies of the Neanderthals weren't simple. They were complex, multifaceted adaptations that combined biological traits, environmental knowledge, technological innovation, and social organization. They represent 400,000 years of accumulated wisdom about surviving in the harshest climates humans have ever regularly inhabited, and they worked. For hundreds of thousands of years, through climate swings that would have killed less adapted populations, the Neanderthals persisted. Not despite the cold, but because they had learned to turn natural architecture into livable space through strategic selection and careful modification. Now let's talk about what Neanderthals were actually eating, because this is where the survival story gets really interesting and kind of gruesome, but mostly fascinating. We've established that Neanderthals couldn't rely on fire for warmth. They lived in brutally cold environments for hundreds of thousands of years. Their bodies were adapted for cold, sure, but bodies need fuel. Lots of fuel. And in Ice Age Europe, there was really only one reliable source of the high-calorie nutrition needed to power a cold-adapted human through an 8-month winter. Meat, specifically fat. The evidence for this comes from multiple sources, but the most compelling is isotope analysis. When scientists examine the chemical signature preserved in Neanderthal bones, they find something remarkable. Neanderthals weren't just eating meat regularly, they were eating almost nothing but meat. We're talking 80 to 90% of their diet coming from animal sources during glacial periods. To put that in perspective, that's more carnivorous than wolves, more meat-focused than lions. Neanderthals weren't omnivores who occasionally hunted. They were hypercarnivores, apex predators whose entire survival strategy revolved around killing and consuming large animals. But here's what makes this relevant to our winter survival question. They weren't just eating any meat, they were specifically targeting the fattiest parts of the fattiest animals. Because in Ice Age Europe, fat wasn't just food, it was survival technology. Think about the physics of staying warm. Your body generates heat through metabolism. The more calories you burn, the more heat you produce. But not all calories are equal when it comes to cold weather survival. Carbohydrates burn fast and hot but don't sustain. Proteins require significant energy to digest and process. Fat, though. Fat is the perfect cold weather fuel. 1 gram of fat contains 9 calories, compared to 4 for carbohydrates or protein. That's more than double the energy density. But the advantages go beyond just calories. When your body metabolizes fat, it produces heat as a byproduct. This process, called thermogenesis, is exactly what you need when you're trying to maintain core body temperature in sub-zero conditions. Modern Arctic peoples understood this instinctively. Traditional Inuit diets consisted of up to 75% fat during winter months. They didn't do this because it tasted good, though animal fat does taste good when you are adapted to it. They did it because anything less, and they would freeze to death. Neanderthals figured out the same thing, but they took it further. Because they couldn't create reliable artificial heat sources, they needed even more calories from fat just to maintain basic survival. Estimates suggest an adult Neanderthal might have needed 4,000 to 5,000 calories per day during winter. That's nearly double what a modern human needs. To get that much energy, they became specialists in hunting the largest, fattiest animals in Ice Age Europe. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, reindeer during their peak, fat accumulation periods. Cave bears. These weren't just any prey animals. These were walking warehouses of exactly the kind of calories Neanderthals needed to survive. The archaeological evidence shows they knew exactly which parts to prioritize. At Neanderthal kill sites, we find bones that have been systematically processed for marrow extraction. Long bones smashed open with precision. Skulls cracked to access brain tissue. These aren't the marks of desperate scavengers eating whatever they can find. This is systematic processing of high-value tissues by people who knew exactly what they were looking for. Bone marrow and brain tissue are incredibly rich in fat. They're also rich in specific nutrients that become crucial during long cold winters. Vitamin D, which you can't get from sunlight when days are only a few hours long. Vitamin A, essential for immune function. Omega-3 fatty acids, critical for brain development and cognitive function. But Neanderthals went even further. Evidence suggests they were specifically targeting organs. Livers, kidneys, hearts. Modern hunter-gatherers in cold climates prioritize these same tissues, not because they taste better than muscle meat, but because they're nutritionally denser. A reindeer liver contains more concentrated vitamins and minerals than pounds of muscle tissue. There's also evidence that Neanderthals were consuming adipose tissue, pure fat deposits from around organs and under the skin of large mammals. Some researchers have suggested they might have been rendering this fat, processing it in ways that made it easier to store and consume. We can't prove this definitively because fat doesn't preserve well in the archaeological record, but the logic is compelling. Think about it from a survival perspective. You kill a mammoth in late autumn. That's potentially thousands of pounds of meat and fat. You can't eat it all before it starts to rot, even in cold weather. But if you can separate and store the fat, suddenly you have a concentrated energy source that can last months. And here's where it gets really interesting. Fat doesn't just provide internal fuel. There's intriguing though controversial evidence that Neanderthals might have used animal fat externally as a kind of insulation layer on their skin. Modern Arctic peoples have traditionally used seal fat and other animal oils as protection against cold and wind. Rubbed into skin, fat creates a barrier against moisture loss and provides an additional layer of insulation. Some researchers think Neanderthals might have done the same thing with mammoth fat or bear grease. We can't prove this from the archaeological record. Fat-based cosmetics or treatments wouldn't leave traces on stone tools or in cave deposits, but we can look at the logic. Neanderthals had access to massive quantities of animal fat. They were living in extremely cold, dry conditions that would cause severe skin damage without protection. They were intelligent, problem solvers who had survived in these environments for hundreds of thousands of years. Would they have figured out that rubbing fat on their skin made them warmer and prevented frostbite? It seems almost certain they would have. The question is just whether they systematically exploited this or discovered it occasionally by accident. What we know for sure is that their hunting strategies were specifically optimized for acquiring high-fat prey. This wasn't opportunistic scavenging. This was systematic, planned predation targeting specific animals at specific times of year. Reindeer, for instance, accumulate fat throughout summer and early autumn, reaching peak body condition just before winter. That's exactly when Neanderthal kill sites show concentrated reindeer hunting. They weren't taking whatever they could get, they were timing their hunts to maximize fat acquisition. This same pattern shows up with other prey species. Mammoth hunting intensifies during periods when these animals would have been at their fattest. Cave bear kills cluster in late summer and early autumn, when bears had fattened up preparing for hibernation. This required sophisticated knowledge of animal behavior and seasonal cycles. Neanderthals had to track when different prey species would be in peak condition. They had to understand migration patterns, feeding behaviors, reproductive cycles. They had to plan hunts months in advance, positioning themselves along migration routes or near seasonal feeding grounds, and they had to be incredibly skilled hunters. Because the animals they were targeting weren't easy prey. A woolly rhinoceros is 3 tons of muscle, horn and attitude. A mammoth is even larger. These are dangerous animals that could easily kill human hunters. The fact that Neanderthals regularly brought them down tells us something profound about their capabilities. They probably hunted in coordinated groups, using tactics that modern anthropologists call cooperative ambush hunting. Find a migration route or feeding ground where prey animals concentrate, set up in concealment, wait for the right moment, then attack in coordinated fashion, multiple hunters striking simultaneously to overwhelm the prey's defences. We find evidence of this in the distribution of kill sites. Many are located at natural bottlenecks, narrow valleys or river crossings where large animals had limited room to manoeuvre. Others are near cliffs or steep slopes where wounded animals could be driven to fall. These aren't random locations. They're strategically chosen kill zones that multiply the effectiveness of Neanderthal hunting tactics. But even successful hunting created challenges. How do you preserve thousands of pounds of meat and fat without reliable fire for smoking or cooking? The answer is, you use the environment itself. Ice Age Europe was essentially a natural freezer for half the year or more. Temperatures regularly dropped well below freezing and stayed there for months. In those conditions, meat doesn't rot. It freezes solid. Archaeological evidence suggests Neanderthals understood this and exploited it systematically. Some sites show evidence of what archaeologists call meat caching, storing large quantities of processed meat and fat in locations where cold temperatures would preserve it. Natural rock overhangs facing north, deep cave chambers where temperatures stayed consistently low, even just pits dug into permanently frozen ground. This required planning and foresight. You don't just stumble into systematic food storage. You have to understand that meat preserved now means survival later. You have to remember where you cached food. You have to defend those caches from scavengers, both animal and potentially human. But the rewards were enormous. A group that successfully killed a mammoth and properly stored the fat and meat might have enough high-calorie food to survive an entire winter. That's the difference between life and death when you're living through 8 months of sub-zero temperatures without reliable fire. There's also evidence of seasonal dietary variation. During brief summer periods, when plant foods became available, Neanderthals did supplement their diet with nuts, seeds, and possibly tubers. Isotope analysis shows slight shifts in diet composition during warmer months. But these plant foods were never more than a small percentage of total caloric intake, and they disappeared entirely during the long winters. Then it was back to pure carnivory, living off stored fat and whatever animals could be hunted in deep snow and bitter cold. This created what biologists call a feast or famine metabolic pattern. Periods of relative abundance when successful hunts provided massive caloric surpluses, followed by periods of scarcity when stored food ran low and new kills were difficult. Neanderthal bodies seem to have been adapted to handle this. Their robust build and heavy musculature would have provided built-in energy storage. Their large nasal passages and enhanced respiratory systems would have supported the intense metabolic demands of cold weather survival. Their entire physiology was optimized for converting high-fat animal tissue into body heat and stored energy. But there was still one more factor that made this dietary strategy viable. Neanderthals weren't competing with many other predators for the same resources. Ice Age Europe had other carnivores, of course, cave lions, cave hyenas, wolves. But most of these specialized in smaller prey or different hunting strategies. Neanderthals, with their focus on taking down the largest megafauna, occupied a unique ecological niche. They were doing something few other predators could do, systematically hunting animals that were simply too large and dangerous for most carnivores to tackle regularly. This gave them access to a food source that was relatively uncontested. Yes, they had to compete with each other, different Neanderthal groups targeting the same prey populations. But they didn't face the kind of interspecies competition that would have made their hyper-carnivorous strategy unsustainable. The result was a survival system based almost entirely on converting animal fat into human survival. It was brutal, physically demanding, and required extraordinary skill and courage. But it worked. For 400,000 years, through countless glacial periods and unimaginable winters, Neanderthals kept themselves alive by becoming the most efficient fat-hunting machines in Ice Age Europe. They didn't need fire for warmth. They were burning mammoth fat as fuel instead. Now here's where the story gets frustrating. Because when you're trying to figure out how Neanderthals survived 400,000 winters without reliable fire, the most obvious answer is also the one we have the least evidence for: clothing. Think about it. You wake up in Ice Age Europe. It's negative 20 degrees Celsius outside. You don't have a fire. What's the first thing you reach for? Something to wrap around your body. something to keep the heat in and the cold out. For modern humans, this is such an obvious solution that it barely needs stating. But for Neanderthals? We have almost no direct evidence, and that's not because they didn't use clothing. It's because clothing doesn't survive. Organic materials, the stuff that would actually keep you warm, hide, fur, leather, plant fibers, they decompose. They rot away within decades, sometimes years. The archaeological sites we're digging up aren't 500 years old, they're 50,000 years old, 100,000 years old, sometimes 400,000 years old. At those timescales, organic materials simply vanish. They break down into soil, leaving almost nothing behind. So when archaeologists excavate Neanderthal sites, they find what survives. Stone, bone sometimes, teeth, the hard stuff that can last for millennia. But the soft materials, the things that would have been most crucial for cold weather survival, gone. Erased from the archaeological record as completely as if they never existed. This creates what researchers call a preservation bias. We're not seeing a complete picture of Neanderthal technology. We're seeing only the tiny fraction that happened to be made from materials that don't decompose. It's like trying to understand modern human civilization by looking only at concrete buildings and metal tools. You'd miss clothes, books, furniture, most of what makes daily life actually livable. But just because the clothing itself doesn't survive doesn't mean we're completely in the dark. Because making clothing leaves traces, subtle traces that require careful analysis to detect, but traces nonetheless. The first clue comes from stone tools. Not the tools themselves, but the microscopic wear patterns on their edges. When you use a stone scraper to process animal hide, it leaves distinctive scratches and polish on the stone surface, different from the wear patterns you get from cutting meat or working wood. Under high magnification, archaeologists can read these wear patterns like a record of ancient activities, and Neanderthal sites are full of scrapers with hide processing wear patterns, not just occasional tools, whole assemblages dedicated to leather working. Some sites show evidence that Neanderthals were processing dozens, maybe hundreds of animal hides, far more than they would need just for carrying bags or simple ground covers. They were making something that required lots of processed leather, and in Ice Age Europe, there's really only one thing that makes sense: clothing. The wear patterns tell us even more. Neanderthal scrapers show evidence of intensive use, the kind of repeated scraping necessary to thoroughly process raw hide into soft, flexible leather. This isn't casual hide working. This is systematic leather production requiring significant time and effort. Some tools show what archaeologists call rotational wear, patterns suggesting they were used to make circular motions, exactly what you'd expect from working a hide stretched on a frame. Others show linear wear patterns consistent with cutting leather into specific shapes or sizes. Put it together and you get a picture of organized leather working. Neanderthals weren't just skinning animals and draping raw hides over their bodies. They were processing hides, softening them, probably treating them with animal fats or brains to make them more pliable and water-resistant, then cutting them into specific forms. But what forms? That's where things get contentious. By 40,000 years ago, modern humans in Europe were creating fitted clothing. We know this because we find specialized tools, eyed needles made from bone that could thread sinew through leather, awls for punching holes, evidence of tailored garments with seams and careful construction. This technology appears suddenly in the archaeological record with the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, and it represents a major innovation. Fitted clothing that could be adjusted to seal out cold air, with sleeves, hoods, maybe even primitive pants. Did Neanderthals have this technology? Almost certainly not. No Neanderthal site has produced the kind of bone needles that would be necessary for sewing fitted garments. The tools just aren't there. But that doesn't mean they were going naked. It means they were probably using a different approach. The debate in archaeology circles right now centres on whether Neanderthals created simple draped garments or something more sophisticated. Draped clothing means animal furs or leather worn like cloaks or wraps. No sewing required. Just throw a hide over your shoulders, maybe tie it with a leather thong, and you've got instant insulation. It's not as efficient as fitted clothing, but it's far better than nothing. And here's the thing. In extremely cold conditions, draped furs work remarkably well. Arctic peoples managed for thousands of years using animal hide clothing. That was relatively simple in construction. The key isn't complex tailoring, it's layering. Multiple hides creating dead air spaces that trap body heat. A Neanderthal wearing 2 or 3 layers of animal fur, even without sewing, would have been well protected against temperatures that would kill an unclothed human in hours. The cold air couldn't reach their skin. Their body heat, trapped between layers, would create a warm microclimate right against their body. Some researchers think Neanderthals went further. They point to stone tools that might be primitive awls, simple pointed implements that could punch holes in leather. You don't need a needle to create joined garments. You can lace pieces of hide together through punched holes using leather thongs or plant fibres. It's more labour-intensive than sewing, but it works, and it would allow creation of more fitted garments, sleeves, hoods, even primitive mittens, all without requiring the bone needle technology that modern humans developed later. The problem is we can't prove it. Those supposed awls might have been used for other purposes, punching holes in wood, working plant materials, any number of tasks that leave similar wear patterns. Without the actual garments, we're left making educated guesses based on circumstantial evidence. But some of that circumstantial evidence is pretty compelling. Consider the environmental conditions Neanderthals lived in. Winter temperatures in Ice Age Europe regularly dropped to -20, -30 degrees Celsius. Winds that could strip heat from exposed skin in minutes. Wet snow and freezing rain that would soak through simple hide wraps. Under these conditions, certain body parts become critical vulnerabilities. Hands and feet lose heat rapidly because they're far from the body's core. Exposed fingers become numb and useless within minutes of cold exposure. Frostbite can set in quickly, potentially leading to tissue loss and infection. Did Neanderthals have mittens? Boots? We have no direct evidence, but it's hard to imagine them surviving without some kind of extremity protection. Simple leather bags wrapped around hands, tied at the wrist, would function as crude mittens. Animal hide wrapped around feet and lower legs would create primitive boots. There's indirect support for this idea. Neanderthal remains show remarkably little evidence of cold-related injuries or pathologies. Their skeletons don't show the kind of bone damage you'd expect from repeated frostbite. Their teeth don't show stress markers consistent with chronic hypothermia. Somehow they were keeping their bodies warm enough that cold exposure wasn't causing permanent damage. That suggests pretty sophisticated cold weather clothing. Not just a single hide draped over the shoulders, but multiple layers, protection for extremities, probably head coverings to prevent heat loss from the scalp. The social implications of this are profound. Making clothing, especially effective, cold weather clothing, is time-consuming. Processing a single animal hide into usable leather can take days. Scraping away fat and tissue, treating the hide to keep it supple, working it until it's soft and flexible, then cutting it into useful forms. This is labour-intensive work requiring skill and patience. In Neanderthal groups, this would have been a major communal activity. Probably while some individuals were out hunting, others were back at camp processing hides from previous kills. This division of labour suggests sophisticated social cooperation, people taking on different roles, trusting that others would contribute their specialised skills to the group's survival. There's evidence that Neanderthals were doing exactly this. Archaeological sites show activity areas. spaces where stone tool manufacturing happened, separate from areas where hide processing occurred, separate from areas where food was consumed. This spatial organization suggests that different individuals or groups were specializing in different tasks, working in their designated areas, contributing their output to the collective good. Clothing production would fit perfectly into this pattern. Skilled individuals, probably those who had spent years learning the craft, taking responsibility for processing hides and creating garments. Others providing food and raw materials, everyone contributing what they could to ensure the group's survival. This kind of cooperation requires trust, long-term relationships. The confidence that your investment in clothing production for others will be reciprocated when you need help. It's the same kind of social glue that allows human societies to function at scale. But here's what really keeps researchers up at night. If Neanderthals had sophisticated clothing technology good enough to keep them alive in extreme cold for hundreds of thousands of years, why don't we find more evidence of it? Part of the answer is preservation. Organic materials don't survive. We've established that. But there should still be more tool evidence, more specialized implements clearly designed for clothing production. With modern humans, once they developed fitted garment technology, the tools show up everywhere. Needles, awls, specialized scrapers, all clearly identifiable as clothing-related implements. With Neanderthals, the toolkit is more ambiguous. Yes, there are scrapers with hide-working wear patterns. Yes, there might be awls, but there's no smoking gun. No tool that screams, this was definitely used for making clothes. Some researchers interpret this as evidence that Neanderthal clothing technology was relatively simple, draped furs rather than constructed garments. Minimal processing beyond basic scraping. Good enough to provide some protection, but not sophisticated enough to leave a strong archaeological signal. Others think we're just not recognizing the evidence. That Neanderthal clothing production used different tools and techniques than later modern human approaches, leaving traces we haven't learned to identify yet. There's a third possibility that's even more interesting. Maybe clothing wasn't as crucial to Neanderthal survival as we assume. Maybe their biological cold adaptations, their high-calorie diet, their shelter strategies, their behavioral thermoregulation, maybe all of these combined were sufficient that clothing was just a backup system. Nice to have, but not absolutely essential. This would explain the ambiguous tool evidence. If clothing production wasn't a daily necessity, but more of a supplementary technology used during extreme conditions, you'd expect exactly what we see. Some evidence of hide processing, but not the intensive specialized tool manufacture that suggests clothing was central to survival. But this interpretation has problems too. Because the cold Neanderthals faced wasn't occasional, it was constant. Winter after winter for 400,000 years. It's hard to believe any biological adaptation could fully compensate for that without some kind of artificial insulation. So we're left with uncertainty. Frustrating, maddening uncertainty. We know Neanderthals survived impossible cold. We know clothing would have helped tremendously. We have indirect evidence they were processing hides extensively, but we can't prove exactly what they were making or how sophisticated their cold weather gear actually was. What we can say is this. Whatever clothing technology they possessed, it was good enough. Good enough to keep them alive through the worst climate conditions Europe had experienced in millions of years. Good enough to allow them to not just survive but thrive, hunt successfully, raise children, build cultures. Good enough to work for 400,000 years without the kind of reliable fire control that we once assumed was essential for human survival in cold climates. The absence of direct evidence doesn't mean absence of capability. It means we're looking at a survival strategy so ancient that time has erased most of the proof, leaving us to reconstruct the past from shadows and traces and the stubborn fact of Neanderthal persistence against all odds. But what if the most important survival technology Neanderthals possessed wasn't a tool at all? What if it was something far simpler, far more fundamental? What if it was each other? Because here's the thing about enduring 400,000 winters without reliable fire. You can have all the biological adaptations in the world, thick bones, efficient metabolisms, enlarged nasal passages, but at the end of the day, when the temperature drops below freezing and stays there for months, when the wind is howling through your cave and there's no firewood available, you need heat, and if you can't make it, you have to find another source. The answer was right there. Other bodies. This sounds almost too simple to be important, but the physics are undeniable. The average human body generates about 100 watts of heat continuously, just from existing, from metabolism, from the chemical reactions keeping you alive. That's like a small space heater running constantly. Now put 15 or 20 of those bodies in a confined space, pressed close together, and you're not talking about small amounts of heat anymore. You're talking about significant thermal energy, enough to raise the ambient temperature of a small cave or rock shelter by 10, 15, maybe 20 degrees Celsius. The archaeological evidence for Neanderthal social structure suggests they lived in small groups, probably between 10 and 30 individuals, extended family units that stayed together year-round. This isn't coincidental. There's an optimal group size for survival in cold environments, and Neanderthals seem to have found it. Too small, and you don't have enough bodies to generate significant shared warmth. You also lack the hunting power to take down large game, and you're vulnerable to catastrophic losses when accidents or illness strike. Just a couple of deaths could collapse the entire group. Too large, and you can't find enough food to support everyone during lean periods. You need bigger shelters, which are harder to heat. You have more interpersonal conflicts. The logistics become impossible when resources are scarce. But 15 to 25 people? That's the sweet spot. Enough bodies to create a genuine heat reservoir when everyone huddles together. Enough hunters to take down large prey. Enough adults to care for children and elders. But not so many that you can't feed everyone during the worst months. The shelters themselves seem designed around this principle. Neanderthal cave sites typically show occupation in the deepest, most protected areas, not near the entrance where light would be better, but far back where the space is naturally confined. These aren't living areas chosen for convenience or comfort. They're thermal refuges, small enough that body heat accumulates, protected enough that wind doesn't carry that heat away. Some sites show evidence of stone walls built to reduce cave openings even further. Not for defense, but for heat retention, creating smaller spaces within larger caves, the same principle you'd use to build a modern energy-efficient house. Minimize volume, maximize insulation, trap heat where it's generated. And then there's the direct evidence, the arrangement of the spaces themselves. Archaeological analysis of Neanderthal cave sites shows where patterns on floors consistent with multiple individuals sleeping in close proximity. Not spread out around the cave like modern humans often arrange themselves, but clustered together in the warmest spots. You can see it in the distribution of artifacts, the concentration of occupation debris, the way sleeping areas were organized. They were huddling, deliberately, systematically as a primary survival strategy. This isn't speculation. We can observe the same behavior in virtually every mammal species that survives cold climates. Emperor penguins huddle in groups of thousands, rotating positions so everyone gets time in the warm center. Wolf packs sleep piled on top of each other during winter. Even animals as small as mice will aggregate in groups during cold periods, their combined body heat keeping everyone alive when individual survival would be impossible. Neanderthals were doing the same thing, using social behavior as thermoregulation, turning the group itself into a survival technology. But this strategy has profound implications for Neanderthal social structure. Because huddling isn't just about staying warm, it's about trust. You can't huddle with someone you're afraid of, someone you don't trust not to hurt you while you're sleeping. You can't maintain this kind of intimate physical proximity for months at a time without deep social bonds. This means Neanderthal groups had to be incredibly cohesive. Not just cooperative in the sense of hunting together or sharing food, but bonded at a fundamental emotional level. They needed social structures that prevented internal violence and maintained group harmony even under the extreme stress of winter survival. The fossil evidence supports this. We have multiple examples of Neanderthals who survived catastrophic injuries, breaks and wounds that would have been fatal without extended care from others. There's the Shanidar 1 skeleton from Iraq, an older male with a withered arm, healed ribs and head trauma, who lived for years after his injuries. Someone had to feed him, protect him, keep him warm during winters when he couldn't contribute to his own survival. There's the Saint-Césaire skeleton from France, showing evidence of a partially healed skull fracture. There's the La Chapelle-aux-Saints skeleton, an elderly individual with severe arthritis who would have needed assistance with basic daily tasks. These aren't isolated cases, they're a pattern. Neanderthals took care of their injured and elderly, even when those individuals couldn't contribute economically to the group. This only makes sense if the group itself was the survival unit. If keeping the group intact, maintaining its social bonds and shared knowledge, was more important than the immediate economic utility of any individual member. And in the context of behavioral thermoregulation, this makes perfect sense. An elderly Neanderthal who can no longer hunt is still generating 100 watts of heat, still contributing to the thermal reservoir that keeps everyone alive during the coldest months, still worth keeping alive, not just for emotional or social reasons, but for practical survival purposes. But the most fascinating aspect of behavioral thermoregulation is what it suggests about Neanderthal activity patterns during winter. Because here's something most people don't consider. If you're relying on shared body heat to survive, you need everyone in the same place at the same time. You can't have half the group off hunting while the other half stays in. The shelter. That defeats the entire purpose. This suggests Neanderthal winter strategies involved extended periods of inactivity. Not hibernation, in the true sense, but something similar. Reduced activity periods where the entire group remained in the shelter, minimizing energy expenditure, maximizing heat retention, waiting out the worst of the winter weather. There's some controversial evidence for this. Recent bone analysis of Neanderthal remains from Atapuerca in Spain showed what researchers interpreted as possible seasonal variations in bone growth, patterns that might indicate periods of reduced metabolic activity. The researchers compared these patterns to those seen in hibernating mammals, cave bears and ground squirrels, and found intriguing similarities. Now, this is hotly debated. Human hibernation sounds like science fiction, but it's not impossible. Even modern humans show some capacity for torpor under extreme conditions. People who experience severe hypothermia can enter metabolic states, where their oxygen consumption drops dramatically. Some populations living in extreme cold show seasonal variations in metabolic rate, not hibernation, but measurable reductions in energy expenditure during the worst months. For Neanderthals without reliable fire, some form of adaptive torpor makes sense. If you can't maintain a high activity level during winter anyway, if food is scarce and foraging is dangerous, why not reduce energy expenditure? Spend more time sleeping, lower your metabolic rate, let your body temperature drop a few degrees while huddling with your group for warmth. The energy savings would be substantial. A modern human at rest uses about 1,500 calories per day. Drop your metabolic rate by just 20% and you're down to 7,200 calories. Over a 4-month winter, That's a savings of 36,000 calories, roughly equivalent to 40 pounds of body fat. For a population living on the edge of starvation, that could mean the difference between survival and death. And the social dynamics would support this. If everyone is sleeping longer, remaining inactive together, the group cohesion required for effective huddling is maintained. You're not trying to coordinate schedules, not waiting for hunters to return before everyone can huddle for warmth. You're all in it together, all following the same rhythm of extended rest, punctuated by brief periods of activity for food gathering and essential tasks. Think about the logistics. Winter hits, temperatures drop, food becomes scarce. The group retreats to their deepest, most protected cave chamber. They huddle together for warmth, adults surrounding children, everyone pressed close. They sleep longer than they would in summer, maybe 12, 14, 16 hours a day. When they're awake, activities are minimal. Someone might venture out briefly to check cached food supplies or gather water from a nearby stream, but mostly they wait, conserving energy, maintaining body heat, surviving until spring. This strategy would have been especially critical for child survival. Neanderthal children, like all human children, had relatively high surface area to body mass ratios, meaning they lose heat faster than adults. They also had higher metabolic demands for growth. Without the ability to generate their own reliable heat sources, these children would have been completely dependent on adult body heat for survival. The positioning within huddles would have been strategic. Children and elderly individuals with reduced capacity to generate heat would be placed in the center, surrounded by robust adults. Pregnant women, with their increased metabolic demands, would get prime positions. Young adults with the highest heat output would form the outer layer, the thermal shell protecting the more vulnerable individuals inside. This isn't just speculation. We can observe exactly these patterns in modern cold climate mammals. Penguin chicks are always protected in the center of the huddle. Wolf packs position their pups and nursing mothers in the warmest sleeping spots. Even bats in hibernation clusters arrange themselves by age and reproductive status, with the most vulnerable individuals getting the best positions. Neanderthals were smart enough, social enough, and under enough pressure to develop the same strategies. The archaeological evidence for child survival in Neanderthal populations is actually quite good compared to earlier human species. Despite living in harsh environments with limited resources, Neanderthal children seem to have had decent survival rates. That only works if adults are actively prioritizing child survival, sacrificing their own comfort and resources to keep the next generation alive. And here's where the evolutionary psychology gets interesting. This kind of intensive cooperative care, this willingness to suffer personal discomfort for the survival of the group, requires powerful emotional bonds. You don't endure months of cramped, uncomfortable huddling for abstract concepts of genetic fitness. You do it because you love your children, your siblings, your parents. Because the thought of them dying is unbearable. Neanderthals must have been deeply emotional beings, capable of intense attachment, powerful empathy, the kind of prosocial feelings that make self-sacrifice feel not just acceptable but necessary. The burial practices we've found suggest this. The care for injured individuals confirms it. The very fact that they survived 400,000 winters proves it. Because here's the thing, you can't force people to huddle. You can't compel cooperation at that intimate level through dominance or threat. It has to be willing, enthusiastic even. Everyone has to buy into the strategy completely. One person refusing to participate, hoarding warmth, taking the best position without regard for others, that breaks the system, that gets people killed. So Neanderthal groups must have had powerful social mechanisms for maintaining cooperation, maybe storytelling during those long winter nights, tales that reinforced group identity and shared purpose, maybe gift-giving practices that created obligations and strengthened bonds. maybe spiritual beliefs that framed survival as a collective responsibility, everyone's duty to everyone else. We'll never know the details, the specific cultural practices that made Neanderthal cooperation work, but we know it did work. For 400,000 years, across countless winters, Neanderthal groups held together, children were protected, elders were cared for, the injured were nursed back to health, all in the absence of the one technology, fire, that would have made everything so much easier. They survived because they had each other, because they'd turned social bonds into survival technology, transformed cooperation into heat, made the group itself into a living shelter against the cold. It's perhaps the most human thing about them, the most recognizable, because we still do it. When things get desperate, when the world gets cold and dark, we still reach for each other, still huddle together against the storm, still find that our greatest survival tool isn't something we can hold in our hands, but something we carry in our hearts. The capacity to care, to cooperate, to survive together or not at all. So here's where this story gets really interesting. Because what we've just uncovered about Neanderthal survival without reliable fire, it doesn't just change how we understand one extinct human species. It fundamentally challenges some of the most deeply held assumptions about human evolution itself. For over a century, the story we've told ourselves goes something like this. Fire was the game changer. Fire was what separated humans from animals. Fire was what allowed our ancestors to develop larger brains, because cooked food was easier to digest and provided more calories. Fire was what enabled abstract thinking, because sitting around campfires gave us time for storytelling and social bonding. Fire was what made us human, except the Neanderthals complicate this entire narrative, because here were people, actual humans with brains as large or larger than ours, surviving in the harshest environments on Earth for 400,000 years, and they weren't reliably using fire for most of that time. They were humans before fire was dependable. They were cognitively complex, socially sophisticated, technologically innovative, and they did it without the supposed catalyst of reliable fire use. Think about what this means. If large brains and complex cognition could evolve without consistent fire use, then fire wasn't the prerequisite we thought it was. It was one survival strategy among many. An important one, sure, but not the magic ingredient that made humanity possible. This forces us to reconsider the entire timeline of human cognitive evolution. Maybe brain expansion was driven by other factors. Social complexity requiring better communication skills, tool use requiring better planning and spatial reasoning, the demands of surviving Ice Age winters requiring better problem-solving abilities. Fire might have been a consequence of increasing intelligence, not the cause of it. The Neanderthals proved you could be smart, adaptive, and successful without mastering fire. They were building complex shelters, creating sophisticated tools, coordinating group hunts, caring for injured and elderly group members, engaging in symbolic behavior like burial practices, all without reliable pyrotechnology. Now let's talk about extinction, because the standard story about why Neanderthals disappeared has always involved them being somehow less capable than modern humans, less intelligent, less adaptable, less innovative. The classic narrative suggests they couldn't compete because they lacked the cognitive sophistication of Homo sapiens. But knowing what we now know about their survival strategies, that narrative starts to look pretty questionable. These were people who survived multiple ice ages without reliable fire. They thrived in environments that would kill an unprepared modern human in hours. They developed biological and cultural adaptations that allowed them to extract calories from their environment with remarkable efficiency. They were adaptation specialists, evolutionarily refined by hundreds of thousands of years of brutal natural selection. So if they were so capable, why did they disappear? The answer probably has nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with flexibility. Neanderthals had become incredibly good at surviving in specific ways. Their robust bodies, their high-calorie diets, their territorial strategies, all of this was optimized for Ice Age Europe. They were like a perfectly tuned racing car, incredible performance under the exact conditions they were designed for. Modern humans, by contrast, were more like off-road vehicles, not specialized for any one environment, but capable of adapting to many different ones. When we encountered Neanderthals around 45,000 years ago, we weren't necessarily smarter or stronger. We were just more flexible. We could switch strategies faster. We could exploit a wider range of food sources. We could adjust our behaviors and technologies to changing conditions more readily. The Neanderthals' very success at cold adaptation might have been their downfall. They had invested so heavily in biological adaptations to cold, robust bodies that required enormous caloric intake that they couldn't easily switch to different survival strategies when conditions changed. When the climate shifted and prey animals migrated to new areas, modern humans followed. Neanderthals, locked into energy-intensive body plans and specialized hunting strategies, couldn't adapt as quickly. This isn't a story about smart humans beating dumb Neanderthals. It's a story about two different survival strategies, biological adaptation versus cultural flexibility, playing out over tens of thousands of years, and in the long run, the more flexible strategy won. But here's what's remarkable. Neanderthals came incredibly close to winning. For hundreds of thousands of years, their strategy worked brilliantly. They survived conditions that no modern human population ever had to face. They did it without one of the technologies we consider essential to humanity. They proved that there isn't just one way to be a successful human. And that brings us to the really important question. What can modern humans learn from Neanderthal cold adaptation strategies? More than you might think, because we're currently living through a period where understanding extreme environment adaptation is becoming critically important. Climate change is making some regions uninhabitable while opening up new territories in others. We're planning missions to Mars and Antarctica and other places where human survival will require managing thermal stress without easy access to fossil fuels. The Neanderthal playbook, shelter selection, behavioral thermoregulation, high-fat diets, group dynamics that minimize heat loss, these aren't just interesting historical facts. They're proven survival strategies refined over hundreds of thousands of years. Modern survival science is essentially rediscovering principles that Neanderthals figured out through evolutionary trial and error. Take the modern understanding of cold weather survival. Military training, mountaineering guides, Arctic research protocols, they all emphasize the same things Neanderthals relied on. Seek natural shelter, stay dry, maintain caloric intake with high-fat foods, use social huddling when necessary. We've systematized and studied these strategies, but we didn't invent them. Neanderthals were using them when our species was still confined to Africa. There's also a profound lesson here about human physiological plasticity. The range of environments that humans can adapt to, from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra, from sea level to high altitude, that adaptability is part of our inheritance from the bottleneck period and its aftermath. Neanderthals demonstrated just how far human biology could be pushed without technological assistance. Their survival proves that our bodies are capable of far more than we typically ask of them. Modern extreme environment research is constantly surprised by what human bodies can do. Free divers who can hold their breath for over 10 minutes, Tibetan populations who thrive at altitudes that would incapacitate lowlanders, Inuit peoples whose traditional diets consisted almost entirely of fat and protein with no apparent health consequences. We act like these are strange anomalies, but they're not. They're evidence of the same adaptive capacity that allowed Neanderthals to survive Ice Age winters. The broader point is this: we've dramatically underestimated the diversity of successful survival strategies in human evolution. For too long, we viewed human development as a straight line from primitive to advanced, from fire-dependent to technologically sophisticated. But evolution doesn't work that way. It produces diversity, different solutions to the same problems, multiple strategies that can all be successful under different conditions. Neanderthals represent one endpoint of human adaptive possibility: biological specialization, robust cold adaptation, energy-intensive survival strategies that work brilliantly in stable environments. Modern humans represent another endpoint: gracile bodies, cultural flexibility, lower individual energy requirements, but greater behavioral adaptability. Neither strategy is inherently superior. They're just different trade-offs in the eternal game of survival. This matters because it changes how we think about human potential. If Neanderthals could survive and thrive without fire, what other supposedly essential technologies might actually be optional? If robust bodies and high-fat diets allowed them to thrive in Ice Age Europe, what other physiological adaptations might be possible for humans facing new environmental challenges? The stereotype of Neanderthals as primitive, brutish, intellectually limited, it's not just wrong. It's insulting to a species that survived longer in harsher conditions than modern humans have yet faced. They were successful humans, different from us but not inferior. They had complex languages, sophisticated tools, symbolic thought, social structures capable of maintaining cooperation across generations. The only thing they lacked was the specific type of cultural flexibility that happened to be advantageous during the particular period when our species encountered them. In a different climate with different selection pressures, Neanderthals might have been the ones who survived and modern humans the ones who went extinct. The archaeological record shows periods when Neanderthal populations were expanding, while early modern humans were struggling. The outcome wasn't inevitable. It was contingent on specific environmental conditions and the particular strengths each species had developed. Modern anthropology is increasingly moving toward this more nuanced view. We're recognizing that Neanderthals weren't failed humans, but successful humans who made different evolutionary trade-offs than we did. They invested more heavily in biological adaptation, and we invested more heavily in cultural innovation. Both strategies worked for hundreds of thousands of years. Ours happened to be slightly more advantageous in the environments where we competed directly. But perhaps the most important lesson is about the relationship between biology and culture in human adaptation. Because what the Neanderthal story really shows is that you can't separate the two. Their biological adaptations, robust bodies, large nasal passages, cold-adapted physiology, these enabled certain cultural strategies while constraining others. Their cultural innovations, sophisticated shelter use, coordinated hunting, social thermoregulation, these reduced the biological selection pressure for certain traits while increasing it for others. Evolution and culture were always working together, not separately. Neanderthals didn't survive despite lacking reliable fire. They survived by developing an integrated biological cultural adaptation strategy that made fire less necessary. That's a completely different way of thinking about human adaptation. Not technology as separate from biology, but technology and biology co-evolving, each shaping the other across thousands of generations. This has implications for how we approach modern adaptation challenges. Climate change, space exploration, extreme environment habitation. We typically think about these problems in purely technological terms. What tools can we build? What energy sources can we deploy? But the Neanderthal example suggests another approach. How can we work with human biological adaptability? What cultural practices can reduce our dependence on energy-intensive technologies? How can we create social and behavioral systems that make survival easier without requiring constant technological support? The research into Neanderthal cold survival without fire is still ongoing. Every new archaeological site, every new genetic analysis, every new experimental archaeology study adds detail to the picture. But what's already clear is that these people achieved something remarkable. They proved that human adaptation is more diverse, more flexible, and more resilient than we ever imagined. They survived 400,000 winters not by conquering nature with fire, but by adapting to nature in ways we're only beginning to understand. They show us that there isn't one correct way to be human, one essential technology, one necessary adaptation. There are many paths to survival, many strategies that can work, many ways of being successfully human, and that's ultimately why this matters. Because we're a single human species now. Neanderthals and Denisovans are gone. But we carry their DNA. We inherited their survival genes. The adaptations that allowed them to survive without reliable fire, those capabilities are still latent in human biology, still accessible if we needed them. We are the descendants of multiple human species, all of whom survived different challenges in different ways. We contain multitudes. Understanding how Neanderthals survived teaches us something profound about what humans are capable of. Not just what we can build or invent, but what we can endure, what we can adapt to, what we can become when survival demands it. They remind us that we're more resilient, more adaptable, more fundamentally capable than our modern, technology-dependent lives might suggest. The Neanderthals survived 400,000 winters without reliable fire. That's not a story of primitive people making do with less. It's a story of sophisticated humans who developed an entirely different relationship with their environment than we did, one that worked for far longer than modern human civilization has existed, and that's worth understanding. Because somewhere in that story is wisdom about survival that we might need again someday. So here we are at the end of our journey through 400,000 winters. 400,000 winters that Neanderthals survived without reliable fire, without the one thing we've always assumed was absolutely essential for human survival in cold climates. And the question we started with, how did they do it, turns out to have been the wrong question all along. Because they didn't just survive, they thrived. For nearly 500,000 years, across some of the most brutal climate swings in Earth's history, Neanderthals maintained populations from Spain to Siberia. They raised children, created culture, developed technologies, buried their dead with ceremony. They weren't barely hanging on, desperately struggling to make it through each winter. They were adapted, perfectly, elegantly adapted to their world in ways we're only beginning to understand. The answer wasn't one thing, it was everything. Biological adaptations that made their bodies into furnaces capable of generating and retaining heat far more efficiently than our own. Shelter strategies that turned caves and rock overhangs into thermal refuges, places where the outside temperature barely mattered. Dietary choices that provided concentrated calories and insulation simultaneously, making fat not just food but armor against the cold. Social behaviors that pooled body heat and shared resources, turning small groups into survival units greater than the sum of their parts. And yes, fire when they could get it, but fire as a tool among many tools, not the single lifeline we've always imagined. Each strategy alone wouldn't have been enough. Put them together, though, and you get something remarkable. A species that could walk across frozen landscapes with minimal clothing, hunt in weather that would kill us in hours, raise babies through winters that lasted 8 months. Not through desperation or luck, but through systematic, comprehensive adaptation developed and refined over hundreds of thousands of years. And here's what really gets me about this story. We almost missed it entirely. For over a century, we looked at Neanderthals through the lens of our own biology, our own survival strategies. We assumed they needed what we need. We interpreted the archaeological evidence through our assumptions about what's essential for human survival. Fire must have been crucial because it's crucial for us. Shelter must have been basic because we need elaborate protection. They must have been struggling because we would struggle in their conditions. But Neanderthals weren't us. They were something else, something that had taken a different evolutionary path, developed different solutions, mastered different strategies. They were proof that there's more than one way to be human, more than one path to successful survival in challenging environments. And before we get too comfortable thinking of ourselves as superior because we're the ones who survived, remember this. Neanderthals carried those survival strategies for 400,000 years. We've been around in our modern form for maybe 300,000 years. They outlasted our early ancestors. They survived climate catastrophes that we've never faced. They adapted to conditions we couldn't handle without modern technology. They only disappeared when they encountered us, and even then they didn't really disappear. Every person of non-African descent carries Neanderthal DNA. Their genes are still here, still helping us fight diseases, regulate our immune systems, adapt to different climates. Those robust bodies might be gone, but their survival strategies live on in our genome. So what's the broader lesson here? Maybe it's about resilience, about the incredible adaptability of the human lineage, our capacity to develop radically different solutions to the same environmental challenges. Maybe it's about humility, recognizing that our way of doing things isn't the only way, that our ancestors weren't primitives stumbling toward our modern perfection, but sophisticated beings with their own forms of genius. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just a reminder that survival takes many forms, that life finds ways we don't expect, that assumptions blind us to possibilities, that the past is far stranger and more remarkable than we usually imagine. The Neanderthal survived 400,000 winters without reliable fire because they didn't need reliable fire. They had something better. They had bodies built for the cold, minds capable of solving complex environmental challenges, social structures that amplified individual resilience, and the cumulative wisdom of thousands of generations who had faced the ice and refused to break. That's not primitive. That's remarkable. If you've enjoyed this journey through deep time and evolutionary adaptation, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a like if this changed how you think about our extinct cousins. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from, whether you're drifting off in New York or already dreaming in Sydney. And if you want more stories about the unexpected ingenuity of our ancestors, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. For now, though, let the Neanderthals fade back into the mists of time. Let their story settle into your mind as you drift towards sleep, and maybe, as you lie there in your warm bed, spare a thought for those robust figures walking across frozen plains 100,000 years ago, warm-blooded and adapted, carrying within them the proof that humans have always been more resilient, more creative, and more remarkable than we ever give ourselves credit for. Sleep well, dream deep, and rest easy knowing that adaptability and resilience are your birthright, inherited from ancestors who survived. Things we can barely imagine. Good night.